Good morning, and welcome esteemed professors, honored guests, fellow students. My colleagues and I are here today to demonstrate why Russia should be considered nothing more than a paper bear who poses little threat to the United States or our allies in Eastern Europe. You'll hear from Alyssa Epstein, who will explain the complexities surrounding Russia's regional relations, especially relating to Ukraine and NATO. She'll explain to you why the primary cause of Russian aggression is the continued expansion of NATO. You'll then hear from Jack Greenberg, our economics expert, who will explain in great detail the economic troubles that face Russia and why these issues exacerbate the feelings of insecurity that Russia is currently experiencing. Finally, you'll hear from Conrad Harron, our military expert, who will lay out the problems facing the armed forces of Russia and the military and industrial complex that supports it. We aim to prove to you that Russia's actions are derived from its own insecurity from NATO expansion in the countries bordering it, and exacerbated by instability in the Russian economy. Before we can give you our policy recommendations and our basic arguments, however, we feel that you must first understand the events of recent years and the reasons behind them. We believe that our story begins in 2008 with the Russian invasion of Georgia. In 2008, the Bucharest summit in Europe tried to induct Georgia and suggested the induction of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Russia, in response to this, lashed out and invaded the now breakaway provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in an attempt to retain its influence in the region. They felt threatened. We believe that Putin felt threatened by the actions of NATO, and he lashed out in an attempt to maintain his own security, to keep himself from feeling surrounded and alienated by what he perceives as Western imperialism. In 2014, the fall of the pro-Russian government during the Maidan protests and the fall in the ousting of Yanukovych and the potential induction of Ukraine into NATO once again threatened Russia and caused them to lash out by annexing Crimea, which Alyssa will talk about soon, and the covert invasion of eastern Ukraine. This is an attempt, once again, to keep it considers an important borderland from falling to Western influence and maintain its own security in the region. Coupled with these actions, the Russian economy has been in a tailspin recently. Starting with the falling gas prices in recent months, which the Russian economy is almost entirely dependent on, and the economic sanctions imposed by our country on Russia following its actions in Ukraine, the ruble has been dropping drastically in value, and inflation is common, which is threatening the very foundation of the Russian economy. We believe that this precarious position is exacerbating all the feelings of insecurity that Putin already feels. So as I was saying, this is just a nice little map of NATO so you can see what's happening. The two countries, Georgia, Ukraine, he feels that Ukraine is an especially important region because Ukraine I should say, has been traditionally a very important borderland when it comes to Western aggression towards Russia. Napoleon invaded through Ukraine, as did Hitler, and he feels like this is a crucial area for his own security. Georgia represents a crucial interest in the south, and it represents a buffer state with our NATO ally in Turkey. Finally, the opposing group mentioned Finland, and you can't quite see it on this map here, but it is directly across the border from the traditional capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. And we believe that similar actions in Finland, trying to induct them into NATO, will result in similar actions that occurred in Ukraine and Georgia. Finally, given the economic uncertainty in Russia, which continues to escalate as a result of tumbling oil prices, as you can see from this map. This was the level of oil prices in 2010. By 2015, they're projected to drop to about here. As you can see, low oil prices have predicated a number of crises in Russian history, including the fall of the Soviet Union, the ruble crisis, and following the war in Georgia and the relations reset, oil prices tumbled once again, which signaled the end of Medvedev. We want to frame to you a Russia that is a paper bear. We want to prove to you that Russia does not currently have the military or economic capabilities to pose a serious direct threat to the United States. The Ukrainian crisis suggests a rational, logical framework for Putin's actions following the NATO-instigated Russian insecurity. We believe that Russia doesn't have some grand strategy that calls for the reclamation of the Russian Empire. Rather, we believe he acts out when he feels threatened by Western encroachment into Russia's former borderlands. As we've seen in both Georgia and Ukraine, Putin's actions show a calculated response to what he perceives as a security threat. while we can't look into Putin's head and see exactly what he's thinking, his actions are consistent with the idea that he's a rational actor and he's acting according to his own rationality. The United States must repair this insecurity before Russia becomes even more aggressive. If we continue the actions we have been taking in the past 5 years, Putin will only act out more and create more instability in his own country and in Eastern Europe. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Alyssa Epstein, our regional expert, who will go into greater detail about all these issues.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the crisis in Ukraine and how we should go about interpreting it. So many Americans believe that Russia is a threat to global peace primarily because of its recent actions in former Soviet states like Georgia and Ukraine, especially in light of Putin's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. There's been clear anxiety in the Western world that Putin's a new type of Hitler or Stalin, bent on expanding the power of his country using force where and when necessary. However, this conclusion that Russia is aggressive because of the greedy, irrational agenda of its leader neglects to take into account the major security interests that Russia genuinely has in Eastern Europe. From Russia's perspective, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, headed by the United States, is a major rival. Indeed, NATO was founded in part to deal with the rising power of the Soviet Union, Russia's predecessor. For the 50 years of its existence, NATO has been continually expanding and now encompasses about 28 countries. To the United States, this action seems peaceful, mutually and universally beneficial even. It provides the assurance of good relations between itself and the new member states and the spreading of American values and ideals and influence abroad. However, to states outside of NATO, including Russia, new admits to the alliance look like losses to Western imperialism. Although in the past NATO expansion may have bothered Russian leaders, it did not become a topic of absolutely vital importance until 2008, when a NATO summit in Bucharest discussed the possible admission of Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance. These two countries are directly on Russia's borders, and it seemed like a threat to Russia. This conference alerted Russia to the urgent fact that NATO must be stopped immediately. Just as the United States would if a rival bloc tried to encompass Mexico or Canada, Russia reacted by lashing out in Ukraine, an action that is both understandable and rational, though a clear violation of international law. Apart from the issue of proximity, which probably would have been sufficient as a catalyst for Russian intervention, Ukraine is important to Russia for military and economic reasons as well. For instance, Sevastopol, Crimea is home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet and is the only warm water port in Russian control. Despite its location in Ukraine, if Ukraine were to join NATO, Russia would probably have lost the port, as Yushchenko, the Western-leaning former president of Ukraine, threatened to do when he decided that he wouldn't extend the Russian lease past 2017. Although this lease was eventually extended under Yanukovych, with his ousting last year in the Maidan Revolution, Sevastopol's status became uncertain again. For that reason, Putin annexed Crimea to ensure that he would be able to maintain control over that port regardless of the internal politics of Ukraine. Adding on to this rationale is Russia's interest in sustaining the unity of the region. Losing Ukraine to NATO could mean a whole wave of NATO induction in other areas of the former Soviet Union. Moreover, it could place many ethnic Russians outside of Russia's sphere of influence and divide the families that live and work on either side of the Russo-Ukrainian border. Although the primary motivating factor, we argue, for Putin's intervention in Ukraine is NATO encirclement and the strategic importance of Crimea, Putin made use of this historical and cultural unity between his country and Ukraine as a way of defending a nationalist propaganda and anti-West rhetoric that gets the public behind his morally gray actions. So if we interpret this propaganda instead of the rationale behind it, the United States will create a bigger enemy out of Russia, which is simply an insecure rival. If we send NATO troops into Ukraine, compound sanctions, and continue expanding the alliance as many hardliners would have us do, this will only heighten Putin's anxiety. Instead, if we understand Ukraine as Russia's way of communicating the intolerability of Western expansion and Western encirclement and back off the region instead, the United States will be more likely to produce a favorable outcome in this crisis. Some of you may be wondering, does Putin get away with his bad behavior in Eastern Europe? To a certain extent, the United States has to acknowledge that Crimea is lost, As a critical security interest to Russia, the West will be unlikely to diplomatically procure a deal that reverses its annexation. Since Putin does not admit his involvement in eastern Ukraine at all, it will be equally difficult for America to negotiate effective terms for his withdrawal there. Moreover, if we recognize that military methods should be off limits if we want to eventually reintegrate Russia into the international environment, isolating American options to deal with this crisis to Eastern Europe leaves us with very few viable strategies. However, fortunately, the United States interacts with Russia in many different fields, including the Middle East, where the U.S. has some common priorities with Russia, including stopping the spread of the burgeoning Islamic State in Iraq and Greater Syria. Recently, also, that Russia helped the United States secure a nuclear deal in Iran. Russia also participates in some activity in the Middle East, such as supporting Assad in Syria with some arms deals that the United States does not necessarily endorse. However, we could use these undesirable actions as potential concessions on Russia's part to compensate for the lack of Western intervention in Ukraine and eventually start opening up the way for cooperation between our two countries. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jack Greenberg, who will tell us a little bit about the economics of Russia.
Good morning, everyone. What I really want to get across to you all today is that pretty much any regularly well-informed person in this country can tell you a little bit about the economic crisis in Russia right now. They understand that oil prices are dropping. They maybe know that sanctions have been imposed on Russia. But what is fundamental to understand about this dilemma is that Russian weakness is not the equivalent of U.S. strength. And what we need to see here is that economic instability exacerbates the already very contentious geopolitical situation in the region. We need to view the current economic crisis in Russia not as a victory for the U.S., but instead as an opportunity to be able to renew our relationship with the state in a much more friendly dynamic that ultimately presents us with opportunities and presents Russia with economic opportunities as well that promotes goals for both of us. So the three fundamental planks of the current economic crisis in Russia are oil prices dropping globally, Western imposed sanctions, and then a third plank that doesn't get quite as much attention as it deserves, a sincere lack of innovation within the Russian economy. So the first one that I want to talk about today is oil. So the strength of oil prices globally and the strength of the Russian economy are inextricably linked. Russia derives 68% of all of its export revenues from the sale of oil and natural gas. So what happens is that when oil prices do really well, like they did in 2007, when oil was priced at about $72 a barrel, Russian GDP actually grew that year at a rate of 8.5%, which is great. However, in March of this year, when oil prices closed at about $48, what we saw instead was that the economy contracted 4.3% in that first quarter. Now, the good news, I guess, in all of this crisis is that Russia's public debt really isn't too great. It's only about $57 billion. It's equivalent to about 10 to 12% of Russia's GDP. What is an issue, however, is that Russia carries a lot of corporate debt. It's actually 10 times that earlier figure. By the end of this year alone, Russian firms are going to owe $130 billion to foreign creditors, and it's looking increasingly likely that they just won't have the means to be able to pay for it. That is something that in and of itself provokes these geopolitically problematic tactics of Putin. Just last week, Russia seized an additional 1.5 kilometer slice of Georgia's most critical oil pipeline. Russia actually built up fences around it, put up demarcation signage to indicate that this was theirs. Russia needed to bring more oil into its economy because that is its only means of propelling itself forward. And because of oil prices currently dropping and because it's too unstable to depend on a single commodity, this is something that needs to change. Otherwise, we can expect more and more geopolitical haphazard behavior. The second plank that I want to discuss with you all today are the Western imposed sanctions that have been put on by the United States as well as our partners in the European Union. This all began, of course, with Putin's annexation of Crimea. That is where there was a round of sanctions that particularly targeted political and economic elites in Russia. With the escalation of the war in Donbass, we saw additional rounds of sanctions that actually targeted whole sectors of the economy. The banking sector, the energy sector, the military industrial sectors were all particularly targeted. And what's really consequential about all of this is that with those sanctions that were put on the banking sector, it didn't matter how creditworthy Russia was on paper. So even though it doesn't carry much debt, when you simply can't get financing into your country, that's really all that matters. That's why Russian bonds right now are only one step above junk ratings. What's a consequence of all of this is that the ruble's value continues to fall. So right now, one US dollar trades for about 57 rubles. By the end of the year, the economic consensus is that one US dollar will trade for 65 rubles. For comparative purposes, one US dollar just last year, last July actually, traded for 34 rubles. The value of the currency has plummeted, and this is something that impacts both the elites in the country as well as the common populace, what we would understand in the United States as the middle class. The price of buckwheat, a common consumer staple, has jumped up 70%. Grocery store shelves are empty because they either can't bring goods into the country or because they're too expensive to be able to market to the mass populace. Access to meat has dried up, fruits, vegetables, dairy products, even hot sauce and Twix candy bars are simply nowhere to be found in grocery stores in Russia. And the fundamental issue underlying all of this, again, is that the Russian populace does not blame the West for blame Putin for this. Rather, his approval ratings remain very high, and instead, these sanctions are only furthering anti-Western sentiments. Third and final plank that I want to talk about in all of this is a lack of innovation in Russia. So the World Bank gathered some data together to talk about how much each of the developed countries in the world, how much their governments are investing in private sector research and development. And in Russia, that figure, you can see, is only about 1.12% of their GDP. By comparison, China earmarked 1.98% of the value of its GDP. The United States committed 2.79%. South Korea did just over 4%. The global average for all this among developed countries stands at 2.13%. So for Russia to maintain this paltry sum of funds available for research and development when it needs to wean itself off of a single commodity-based economy is frankly absurd. It is becoming increasingly evident that Russian innovation is poised to continue its gradual decline into obsolescence through neglect. Otherwise, we will continue to see worthwhile projects in Russia being taken up by entities outside of the US. Think China, think Japan, think Saudi Arabia, think Kuwait. They're the ones who will be able to inject financing into the worthwhile projects that are within the Russian economy while the US is excluded. That's why we've developed a policy proposal that looks to present economic opportunities for the US and ease geopolitical tensions in the region by lifting sanctions. What we will show through contemporary and historic examples that Adrian will follow up on later is that sanctions simply do not work. There are a couple of isolated cases in global history where they are an effective means of deterrence, but by and large, they only increase tensions further. Accordingly, we also believe that economic interdependence is a greater mechanism towards being able to link the interests of the two nations and forging a more cooperative relationship in the future. And with that, I will call up Conrad to deliver his remarks.
Thank you, Jack. In my section of the presentation, I will be talking about US and Russia military relations and arguing 3 points. First, that Russia is not a direct threat to the United States. Second, that Russia's recent surge in military spending is not threatening to the United States. And lastly, why Russia is not a significant threat to Ukraine and other US allies in Eastern Europe. Russia is not a threat to the US militarily in terms of conventional warfare. Concerning conventional warfare, the US is much greater in ability and strength. Our GDP our military budget of $682 billion is 7 times greater than Russia's military budget. The US Navy and Air Force has a clear advantage over Russia with 20 times as many aircraft carriers and twice as many combat aircraft. However, Russia does outnumber the United States in number of tanks, artillery, and land vehicles, but in a sustained conflict, the US's far superior military budget would put it in a much better position to increase production and replace weaponry. Russia's recent surge in military expenditures do not threaten the United States or its allies. Putin's proposal is to increase the Russian defense budget by $120 billion to a $770 billion total through 2020. However, paradoxically, Russia's finance industry has proposed a $125 billion reduction in federal spending through 2020, largely in the defense sector. The ministry is worried about Russia's finances and therefore wants to cut the budget. In sum, Russia will have to choose between a strong defense sector or financial stability. Given our assertion that Putin is a rational actor, Putin will choose a rational and stable choice of financial stability. In addition, there are four major intrinsic problems with Russia's defense sector: corruption, production, exports, and demographics. Until these issues are fixed, Russia's military will be stunted in growth, regardless if Western sanctions are lifted. Russia's defense sector is notorious for inefficiencies and misallocating funds. Sergei Fredinsky, the Russian chief military prosecutor, said that a fifth of the state's defense spending is stolen, and the same amount is estimated to be lost because of inefficiencies in the Russians' military-industrial complex. Russia has to replace 70% of its military equipment within the next 5 years, and it has already replaced 30% of the equipment, but it will take a large amount of cash for the rest of the replacements to be met, money that Russia does not have. The proposal includes intercontinental ballistic missiles, space systems, air defense systems, submarines, aircraft, and other equipment. But many Russian projects are years behind and over budget. The Russian defense industry exists predominantly because of a strong history in defense exports. Russia is the world's second largest arms exporter, accounting for over 10.7 billion of arms contracts. Most of the money accrued from exporting funds the defense sector. However, this is mostly late Soviet technology. Russia lacks modern military technology and has little funding for research and development, and as a consequence, its profits from exporting arms will start decreasing in coming years with more competition in the global marketplace, particularly from China. Regarding demographics, Russia is struggling to meet its quotas. For example, in the past couple of years, Russia has failed to meet its military quota for conscripts by 20%. Russia is trying to remedy this problem by signing more soldiers from contract than conscription. But this is more expensive for Russia because contract troops cost more. In conclusion, until Russia solves the defense sector's intrinsic issues, increases in military spending and lifting economic sanctions will not make it a military threat in the near future. Lastly, Russia is not a significant threat to Ukraine or nearby regional countries. As a reaction to increased NATO encroachment in Russia's backyard, Russia wants more influence in its region and does not want to alienate surrounding countries. The strategic costs of a more overt scale, full-scale or limited invasion of Ukraine or other nearby regional countries are high, while strategic benefits are uncertain. For example, if Russia were to conduct a limited invasion of eastern Ukraine, this time on a larger scale and not using separatists as proxies, it would be disastrous for the Kremlin's plans to ingather the former Soviet Union countries and maintain influence in its region. For example, how would Kazakhstan's president or Belarus's president react to a Ukrainian invasion? Northern Kazakhstan and Belarus are mostly inhabited by Russians and Russian speakers. Both the Kazakhstan and Belarus presidents would, very rationally, ask the question, why should Putin stop there with Ukraine? It would propel those countries to seek security by joining Western-led coalitions and have them leave groups that they are affiliated with Russia, like the Customs Union, the Eurasian Union, and the Russian World Project, which is the exact opposite of what Putin wants. Using the same example of Ukraine, in addition to not furthering Putin's influence in the region, the military, economic, and political costs far outweigh the benefits. Russia is quite capable of seizing a considerable portion of eastern Ukraine, but its casualties would be significant as Ukraine would engage in a war of attrition and use strategies like ambushes, mining approach routes, destroying bridges on approach routes, and installing man-made obstacles to inflict severe casualties. In terms of the economic side, Ukraine's economy is a mess. Its coal and gas reserves are nothing compared to Russia's, and its ports need modernization, making Ukraine invasion not favorable for Russia's economy, instead making its own civilians feel the cost. An invasion of eastern Ukraine would also disrupt its own economy, and since the eastern Ukrainian economy is tied to economies in Russia's western regions, the economic impact would ripple into Russia. An invasion of eastern Ukraine would be a political victory for Putin in the short run, but in the long term, Russia's populace would turn on Putin once they felt the costs. Lastly, a counter-argument may be that since Putin would not gain from a full-scale or limited invasion of surrounding territories, he will engage in more asymmetric and unconventional warfare like he has done in Crimea, using his little green men. However, while there's no feasible way to deny the threat of the little green men, our policy recommendation of having NATO withdraw from Eastern Europe will reduce Putin's insecurity, making unconventional warfare unnecessarily, only provoking a response from the West. And Putin, being a rational actor, therefore would not engage in those military exercises, provided that NATO expansion, that the Western nations stop NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, making Russia not a significant threat to Ukraine or other regional countries. Thank you. And now I'll be handing it off to Adrian, who will be talking about our policy recommendations.
Hello again. I'd like to thank Conrad for that wonderful summary of the military issues facing Russia and the rest of my colleagues for all the hard work they've done. And now I would like to turn your attention to what we propose the United States does about these issues. The first, and we believe most important, is the long-term halting of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. As Alyssa demonstrated very well, NATO expansion has been one of the key reasons for perceived Russian aggression in the East and attempts to induct nations like Ukraine and Georgia into it to spark swift action from an insecure Russia. Continued attempts to expand NATO into countries that border Russia will only serve to alienate and threaten Russia and will create further instability in the region. A moratorium on NATO expansion is a necessity if we want to create a more secure partner in Russia, and it will help to bring stability to a region as Russia's security fears are remedied. The second is a gradual lifting of US-imposed economic sanctions on Russia. We propose that these gradual lifting of sanctions will come with a number of concessions from Russia in order to show the American people that we are not tolerating bad behavior, but rather we're trying to work with Russia and make them a partner. The first round will consist of the lifting of sanctions on individuals in Putin's inner circle in exchange for a declaration respecting the sovereignty of Ukraine. This is a way to really show Putin that we're willing to work with him, and it's more of a show of trust, and that shows that we can trust him, he can trust us in exchange. The second round will play out gradually over time and will lift sanctions on the banking, energy, and defense companies in Russia in exchange for Russian cooperation in the Middle East, especially in combating ISIS, working with us in Syria to try to help the situation there, and continued cooperation over Iran, which we've seen has already borne fruit in our cooperation over them in the Iran nuclear deal. These policies will help boost the Russian economy. It will improve relations between our two countries and help remedy one of the primary factors behind Russian aggression in the East. Historical precedent shows that economic sanctions designed to deter aggression and hold down rivals generally fail to work. We can look at Serbia in the 90s, for example. Tough economic sanctions were opposed in the Milosevic government, but they failed to deter wars in both Bosnia and Kosovo. These conflicts were only resolved through multilateral use of force, which is not possible against a country of Russia's influence and size. Sanctions against communist Cuba also failed, with the Castros remaining in power to this day. The U.S. government has even taken a significant step in ameliorating relations with Cuba, including the opening of full diplomatic relations in recent days and the reduction of sanctions on the country as a whole. This is a contemporary example of the United States admitting its previous policies, such as the ones that are being set in Russia currently, are a mistake and is consistent with U.S. policy in the modern era. The continuation of economic sanctions on Russia is a mistake. Leaving them in place will only further anti-Western sentiment in the country, harm us and our European allies economically, as Russia looks to other economic partners such as China and other countries in the world, and will fail to deter geopolitically aggressive behavior in the future. An improved Russian economy is an American interest because it will result in a more stable situation in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, open up further, more engaging economic relations between our two countries. Both of these previous policies play into a broad narrative about securing cooperation with Russia as a partner and strategic ally. Putin's primary tools to retain his influence in unstable Russia is the use of anti-Western propaganda and nationalist rhetoric so as to scapegoat the United States for Russia's problems. By lifting economic sanctions, the Russian economy will stabilize and Russian quality of life will improve. Halting of NATO expansion will serve to show the Russian people that the United States is not an imperialist power attempting to surround and alienate the Russian people, but rather a strategic partner whose goal is to promote regional stability and global cooperation. If we do not engage Russia as a partner on the global stage, we risk forcing them to turn to China or other rising powers in the world, which would be detrimental to our own interests. We can look to historical precedents such as the turning of Germany and Japan from major enemies to trusted allies in the modern era. We fought 2 wars against Germany to contain their ambitions, but we decided the prudent choice was not to antagonize them further like a current policy towards Russia stands, but rather integrate them into the global system. Japan was hated by the American public and distrusted by the American government following the events at Pearl Harbor in World War II, but through economic cooperation and the easing of Japanese insecurity, they've become one of our most important allies in Asia. While making Russia a partner of similar trust is still a ways away, we believe that the historical record has shown that it is possible to turn former enemies and rivals into strategic partners through economic cooperation, which we propose through these policies. We believe that with our policies in effect, the future of relations with Russia in the next 10, 20 years is very bright. Thank you. I want to thank my group for helping. I want to thank Russia, the other Russian group, for their presentation. It was very good. I want to thank all of you for coming out today.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I have two questions, but I'll begin with a quip. You skipped over the part where the United States defeated and then occupied Germany and Japan for a few years before that partnership and trust began, which makes me wonder if that might be part of the causal story there. So two questions. The first of which, and you touched on this in the end, is that you present a picture of Putin as a rational actor that's primarily responding to Western pressure and indeed perhaps even expansion and what they see as aggression, and thus acting out of insecurity. I buy the rational and insecure part, but I see Putin as an actor who's responding primarily to Syria's domestic instability. And what he does is sees an opportunity in United States weakness to sate his population by creating problems in the near abroad. And as long as the United States keeps creating those type of opportunities, he will respond in order to maintain his power. So how is it that simply doing things that secure his position helps the United States keep him from getting into his borderlands? Don't you think you have the source of the problem wrong?
That will help.
Well, yeah, so just like we can talk about an economic dimension here for a second, and I think actually that when I would definitely agree with you, Professor Goddard, that when Putin sees an opportunity, he seizes it as a means of being able to secure himself politically. And that's where I think that being able to secure economic opportunities for him and being able to actually relieve the pressure that the Russian populace has seen in recent years as a result of these sanctions, as a result of declining oil prices, is actually something that would be a victory for us, and that it'll ease this geopolitical tension. It also could bring home some economic returns for us. But it's something that is, in truth, a good deal for Putin as well. And that's something that's not necessarily contrary to our interest. When he can present that opportunity, when the sanctions get lifted, that's something that his business and political elites who surround him certainly benefit from. And that's something that will more than likely secure higher approval ratings for him as well. And I think that's definitely, when you consider just being able to manage a domestic economy, if he can produce higher returns, that's something that any executive can sell as a great political accomplishment. And then we can talk about the actual geopolitical matters as well.
Let me just ask a second question. You talk a lot about partnership and collaboration with Russia, particularly in regards to situations in the Middle East. The last time the United States actively really partnered with Russia over situations of the global war on terror. And Putin, Medvedev actually used this basically as an excuse to go into Chechnya and brutally repress and then sometimes massacre the population there. Is that the type of partnership that the United States is once again willing to undertake?
I'll take this one. I don't think that what we really want from them in the Middle East is another Chechnya. I think the idea is that we've started modeling this on a linkage negotiation idea, where if you bargain something economically, you don't have to get something back economically. And we were looking for theaters with geopolitical possibilities, and we decided that Eastern Europe was not a very good idea, and that the Middle East might be a better theater to find something that Russia would be willing to give up. And originally our idea was stopping arms sales to Syria, which we decided maybe he wouldn't be willing to give up. I think the sort of collaboration we're looking for is more of support on deals in the Middle East with Iran, or support in the UN, just political support, not military support.
We've seen, as I mentioned before, with the Iran nuclear deal, we've seen that Russian cooperation is very possible and very useful in the short term and the long term. We don't believe that Putin will attempt, or the former president of Russia will, we don't believe they'll go do something like Chechnya again, because we don't believe it's in their interests. What's in their interest is a stable and secure country, region, where they feel secure and they feel like they don't feel threatened by us.
Okay, couple questions. First one is, I want to push you guys on what your plan with branches are, what the branches of your plan are. what would it take for you to change your mind? So more specifically, under what conditions should the United States be significantly militarily engaged in affairs on Russia's borderlands?
I mean, one brief remark to that is that if after we start lifting economic sanctions as a means of cooperating with Russia and then not engaging in much military adventurism, if they continue to do that and it persists after we start lifting economic sanctions, then I think that's the point at which we realize that our policies might not be effective.
How long would that be?
So I think that a good indication that our policy has failed is if they not just prolong the conflict in eastern Ukraine, but if they try to intervene in other Western countries, especially when there's no threat of NATO expansion. Like, if they started gambling with Belarus or like Finland, then we'd know that we have the interpretation wrong and that the United States should take a different path.
But can you issue a prediction, like if I don't see X by this time, we'll know this failed?
I mean, our policy is more of a stopping further behavior as opposed to rolling back what's happening right now, because we feel that once Putin feels secure, he won't have a reason to, as I said, intervene in any other countries. A failure for all policy is invasion or intervention in, as I said, Finland, a NATO country, which would be disastrous and prove our policies wrong. But we believe that with these policies in effect, he won't have any reason to do that, and he will, once he feels that we're no longer pushing into Ukraine and Georgia, he will begin pulling back support for the separatists there.
Okay, but no date.
I mean,
You're not going to commit.
that's why we propose the gradual lifting of sanctions, so we can like almost take a measured approach to this, so we can see he's actually working with us. We're not going to lift them all at once. We know that these, especially the energy companies, the finance companies, are very important to his economy, and he's going to want to see these lifted to improve his situation in his country. And if we see he's not working with us, we can either not lift them at all or reapply them.
Okay, let me blend the last question with something that Dr. Gata brought up, which is you guys talk a lot about the bleak economic situation in Russia, and I think you paint a pretty stark picture there. But what happens if there's another Russian revolution? What follows from your policy if there's actual revolution?
Yeah, sure, Dr. Parent. Well, I think that ultimately what my concern about the prospect of revolution is that I think that even with the economy where it stands right now, which is very, very, very bleak, what we still see is that Putin is very politically secure. His approval ratings are high. He still has a very firm grasp on the Russian populace. And I think from here it's, especially if our policy proposals were implemented, what we'd see is economic gains. But even if things stagnate from here, or even if it were to get worse, I think what we'll see instead is not a domestic revolution. I think that actually Putin is still very secure, but still feels, because of the geopolitical pressures combined with the economic sanctions, still feels cornered. What would be more than likely, I think, is further aggressive tactics on the geopolitical front in the region. So I think that domestically he's still in fairly good shape, and we'd be more likely to see something go on in the borderlands first. And that's something where I think that we'd have to evaluate the consequences from there.
Okay, I agree with you, but that's still not the question. What if you see something that you don't think is likely?
I mean, it just seems to us with the current position of Putin, it just seems like such a negligible possibility that anything like that could ever even happen. If the economy worsens, he'll just continue his anti-Western rhetoric. The people will continue blaming the West for the issues. And I mean, unless he were to concede, say, if he were to give back Crimea to us, for example, which would have intense political repercussions or something of that state, I highly doubt he would be ousted or his government would collapse. It's just...
But revolutions are horribly difficult to predict, and everyone is surprised by them. So if it happens, then what?
We gotta see what kind of government takes its place. It's difficult to deal with a hypothetical like that.
Specify the type of revolution.
Yeah.
Is it Gorbachev or is it Khrushchev? Like, what type of leader are we getting here?
It's uncertainty.
I think-
We don't know what's going on.
I think a more likely type of revolution would be one in which, like, the Russian government consolidates power to Putin rather than takes it away. Like, from our perspective, that it gives more power and he'd be more likely to be aggressive in that way.
So if there's power consolidation, you would think a more aggressive U.S. response would be good, or if there's
if there's power consolidation after we attempt this plan, then we'll know that our policy has failed.
Okay.
Great. So I have two questions as well. I thought it was a great presentation.
The first one is on the Middle East. So I like the fact that you guys don't just focus on, this one region where there's potentially butting heads, but we look for other areas where there could be some type of grand bargain, which can be a little bit more difficult to pull off, but nonetheless has potential. The problem I have is, I think actually Putin would take the deal that you're saying. He would take a partnership against ISIS to keep Assad in power. The problem is all of the other American allies in the region want the opposite. Turkey, the Saudis, the Qataris, they're all not only angry about the Iran deal the U.S. just signed, but they want to do the opposite. They want to get rid of Assad, and they care more about getting rid of Assad than getting rid of ISIS. So how does that deal potentially, look to our potential allies in the region who are already angry with us? So we kind of partner with the Russians against their interests on Iran. We do the same again in Syria. In many ways, we might lose the Middle East or some of our stability in the Middle East to make some of these concessions in Eastern Europe. So how do you reconcile that?
And I think in some ways we have to ask who's the more important ally that the United States has, and if Russian aggression is really what we're trying to stop, and if we need to stop that by getting the American public to feel like Russia's giving something up in return for lifting sanctions, then it might be more in American interest to make a deal with Russia than it would to sustain some of our allies in the Middle East.
So who's the ally that we're helping in Russia that's a more important ally than our allies in the Middle East?
Potentially Russia.
Our Eastern European neighbors or allies who feel sort of scared of Russia's current aggression, which we find very important.
Okay.
A placated Russia is in a global interest.
I think you can make a fair point that certainly Russia is a bigger threat than ISIS or Assad, so I understand that point. The second point deals with the sanction stuff. So I really liked, Adrian, at the end how you were talking about historical precedent, how that potentially told us that sanctions weren't that effective. But I feel like there's a bit of a tension here because A, if sanctions are a mistake, then why do we not just get rid of them anyway? And B, in some ways what you're saying is sanctions have to work. You're saying that we're going to exchange these sanctions and remove them for Putin giving up something. And then you said in response to Professor Parent, I believe, that if Putin doesn't give this stuff up, we'll keep those sanctions on or raise them. That's the exact logic of how sanctions work. And so you actually are basing your policy on sanctions being an effective thing, except historically you were saying they were ineffective. So which one is it exactly? And are you pinning your hope on something that you just said isn't very worthwhile?
This is something I've been thinking about as we've been crafting this policy. And what the ultimate conclusion, I think, is that there's a difference between politics and governance. And that what we see is that, so sanctions have historically been ineffective, but there's something that at least shows the American public we're doing something, we're taking a stance without having to put boots on the ground, without doing airstrikes or anything along those lines. So even if it is in our best interest to say, you know what, no more sanctions, in exchange for absolutely nothing, that's something that very much could be in U.S. interest, and I would assert that it is. At the same time, though, that's not something that works in the great scheme of playing politics, and that's something that would dissatisfy the American populace, and it is something that makes us look weak on the global stage, and accordingly, there needs to be some kind of exchange for it, even if it's just for pure show.
Does that make sense? So please.
Yeah, I'd also like to respond in terms of looking back at those historical precedents. I think that what we're arguing is not that sanctions are ineffective, but rather they're effective at building resentment in the country. If we look at how war reparations on Germany after World War I, it pushed Germany down and just led to a more aggressive government. And after World War II, we took a different approach. The Marshall Plan reintegrated Germany's economy, and then they became our friend. So what we're trying to do is, we have two goals here. We want to punish Russia, but also become their friend, and you can't do those at the same time. And we're trying to leave them a path of carrots so that they can become our friend if that is possible to fit into Putin's plan. But at the same time, if they don't, then all we know how to do is punish them.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, let's wrap it up for this presentation.